The room was too bright for midnight. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a slice of the city. Lights like coins spilled across the river. But inside the suite, it felt like a stage deliberately cleared of everything that might actually matter. Expensive art leaned against the wall as if waiting for permission to be hung. Fresh flowers sat untouched on a table. A television remote lay on a leather ottoman the size of a coffee table. Machines whispered in a cadence that had nothing to do with comfort. He sat in the middle of all that and watched the lights, hands folded over a blanket. The wheelchair was new, polished, positioned as precisely as any piece in a show home. He had ordered the best doctors, the best scans. They told him, with the clinical gentleness of people who rarely deliver bad news to the well-off, that his spine hadn't been crushed, that walking would be possible if movement and therapy were pursued with patience. He kept quiet about the verdict. When the nurses left, and the corridor quieted into the kind of silence that makes the city sound far off, he let his eyes close and rehearsed the sentence he'd been carrying in his chest like a weight. "I want to know who's mine." He told it to himself, like a fact, not a wrongness or a reckoning. He had money enough to buy the hospital wing. He had a life built of choices other people had made for him. Contracts signed, projects greenlit, margins shaved. He wanted to know whether the people around him loved what his name bought, or the person behind the name. So he began to perform. It was small at first, an ache he feigned more convincingly than he felt, the awkwardness of a hand that would not plant itself on a cane. When the physician stepped into the room to check his charts, he practiced the limp of the shoulder, the way pain pulls at your jaw. He leaned into their concern and let it be what he needed it to be. He watched faces, timed their sympathy. He watched who stayed, who left when the flowers wilted, who called to ask about insurance and who called to ask about him. The first to go was the kind of warmth that comes with pairing. Giovanna arrived like a photograph come to life, handbag, perfume, a smile that seemed rehearsed for public appearances. She kissed him once on the temple, arranged the blanket, laughed at a joke he didn't bother to make. She stayed 3 days. On the third morning she appeared with coffee that smelled like an expensive chain. Caio watched her eyes flick to the wedding band on his finger, then to the cards lining the bedside table, then to the mailbox of unread messages on his phone. "I can't do hospitals all day," she said, picking at the edge of a biscotti as if it were a question she expected to be answered politely. "It feels heavy." She left a note with a lipstick-smudged promise and a plane ticket to where light is easier to find. Business partners were next. Rodrigo came with a lawyer's patience and a tablet full of graphs. He stayed 11 minutes, a schedule in motion. First condolences, then contingency plans, then a remark about liability and the necessity of moving certain projects forward. He hugged him properly enough, took a photo for the press release they would never issue, and left a voicemail with instructions and a seemingly tender, "Call me when you're ready." Friends became brief messages that read like stock updates, phrases full of affection but little interest in the work of staying. One by one, the room emptied of human noise, until it was only filled with the soft, mechanical breathing of monitors and the constant hum outside the window. He noticed the absence like a new sense. He had expected that loneliness. He had assembled it on purpose. The test had a cold, clinical logic to it in his head. Strip away everything purchased and see what remains. One evening, while he watched the street below like a man watching an aquarium, there came a knock that didn't fit any of the predictable patterns. It was not the polished knock of acquaintances, nor the hurried knock of colleagues. It was softer, more matter-of-fact, and it belonged to a woman who stepped in with an old thermos in one hand and a plastic container of food in the other. She wiped her palms on her apron as if it were part of her ritual of arrival. Her face was marked by work, calluses, a sun-weathered tenderness, the particular kind of steady that comes when you must keep other things alive every day. She smiled without the chisel of someone performing. Her smile was a tool, not a costume. "Mr. Dornley's?" she asked, keeping the Mr. like an old habit. "I'm Simone. I clean the offices on 9th and the building at the river. She tilted her head, the way people measure a room against what they carry. "I brought you dinner." He had seen Simone before once or twice, moving through boardrooms like a ghost, quiet, invisible in the white noise of business meetings. She didn't belong to the world of press conferences or weekend galleries. She belonged to the early morning that makes the city wake. Mops, bins, thrifted lunches. Yet when she set the plastic container on his bedside table, the room took a different aspect. The food smelled like home, like patience cooked into rice and stew. She didn't ask about his injury with curiosity. She asked because you'd ask someone at the market about their mother. Direct, practical. After a few minutes of small talk, she pulled a faded photograph from her pocket and handed it to him. It was a picture of a broad-shouldered man with a worker's jacket and a grin, dirt under his nails. "This is Fabio," she said. Her voice didn't shake, not much. "He worked the scaffold at the South Pier. He fell 8 years back. The company said it was an accident. They said everything was up to code. But I know things. People watched pieces break and did nothing. She stopped, closed her hand around the memory, as if it could be re-knit into something useful. "He left us, left the boys with me." When the name fell into the air, it landed on a table of receipts and unpaid bills that Caio had never looked at personally. He remembered the project. He remembered signing memos that fined contractors for overruns, cutting corners that showed up as thin metal where thicker support would have lasted. He remembered arguments about deadlines, about what constituted risk, about how much a delay cost the company's stock. He had heard the family's name before in paperwork. Letters that had been filtered through legal language into denial, settlements couched as one-time assistance. He had never met Fabio. He'd never seen the photograph Simone now set down like an accusation. Silence held them both. For the first time in the exercise he'd designed, Caio felt his face lose the armor he'd placed over it. It wasn't enough to see the graph of profit. Not when it had a name and a face and a family that smelled in his presence of rice and soap and the small shoe of a child. Did you get anything?" Simone asked. The question not quite a demand, but not a plea either. He told a lie. It was easier than telling the truth about memos and margins. "There was a settlement," he said. "The company—" He paused because it was one thing to speak in meetings and another to meet the person the meetings had a shape around. "We sent something." Simone's laugh was short. "They sent an envelope, not enough. The boys still sleep with a light on because I'm afraid of the dark. I scrub floors and take 2 buses to get here. I'm tired, sir." He felt that tiredness like a physical thing, as if it were a weight he hadn't expected to carry. In the days after, Simone came back, not every hour but often enough to anchor the place. She brought rice and beans and a patience that had learned how to deliver truth without dressing it up. She spoke of the kids, Gustavo, 9, who liked to build little forts with scrap cardboard. Bento, 5, small and quick with a laugh. She told him about the leaks in her ceiling and the way the landlord turned blind eyes. And there was a child with a small hand in Simone sometimes, a girl with a quiet that was not silence but attention. Valentina was 8, with olive skin and hair that curled at the nape of her neck. She had a way of moving through rooms that made them feel inhabited rather than staged. She'd come into the hospital in a sweater too big for her, carrying a stuffed rabbit with a seam on its ear. Valentina held Caio's hand the first time she visited. She didn't ask why he wouldn't walk. She didn't rehearse the pity that adults offered. She asked what the ceiling was made of and whether the lights were like stars. When he answered, clumsy under the social skill he normally paid others to perform. She laughed as if he'd said something honest. She wasn't his by blood. She was his because, years earlier after the death of her mother, Mariana, Caio had signed papers that turned pity into custody. He had been the kind of benefactor who wrote a check and promised visits. He had taken legal guardianship the way some people take trophies. Valentina had moved between him and the small neighborhood Simone had kept. There had been holidays, a summer at a lake house, photographs that hung in mismatched frames. The arrangement was complicated and imperfect. He had believed that provision equaled care. Now, in a hospital where illness had become a litmus test, Valentina didn't care for the arrangements. She cared for the one who made games of light from his phone and who could sometimes make up stories that sounded like home. She stayed when others left. The decision to continue the charade had been, in his mind, still a test. He told himself this, that letting others see his weakness would reveal what he most needed. He told himself the harm would be small, that truth could be reassembled once he'd learned who to trust. When he finally and deliberately let the truth fall from his lips, it was because Simone had returned one afternoon with a paper in her hand, a pay stub from years ago, a photograph of a scaffold rope frayed down to threads. "You asked to see my life," she said quietly. "Here it is." He had been watching how people reacted to his loss. He'd wanted to watch them filter him through their obligations and their appetites. He had not expected any of it to land like responsibility. He stood there in the hospital room and felt very small. The habit of wielding language as a defensive blade failed him. "I can walk," he said. The sounds in the room shifted as if something fragile had been broken. Simone's face tightened. "You mean—" She let the rest of the sentence trail. She had given him the truth about Fabio and his boys without ceremony. He had given her a performance. "It was a test," he said, and the word tasted like ash. "For what? To see who'd stay?" she asked. "To see who'd clean up your mess when it hit someone else's life." Valentina, who had been coloring with a cheap set of crayons on a hospital brochure, looked up. "You lied," she said simply. Her voice carried no melodrama, only the unadorned clarity of a child who had learned to trust the world first and learned to be cautious of adults later. "My mom wouldn't like that." It wasn't the accusation that stung so much as the betrayal in Simone's eyes. Her hands tightened around the thermos she always carried. She set it down with deliberation and stood. "I can't be part of that. I didn't come here to be an experiment. I came because people hurt me, and I thought—" Her face darkened as if seeing the past in front of her. "I came because Fabio is gone, not because you wanted to know who loved the chair." She left, taking the photograph and leaving an empty thermos. The door closed in a sound that felt final. Valentina stayed. When he closed the door behind Simone's retreating back, the hospital room felt suddenly like a prop. The machines hummed with a normalness unconnected to what he'd broken. He was left with the choices he had made. Guilt arrived, not as a sharp knife, but as a dull, persistent ache. He thought of numbers, of settlements, and the cold efficiency with which grief is sometimes turned into line items. He remembered Fabio's smile in the photograph and the sound that Simone made when she said his name. He remembered decisions signed in meeting rooms that had valued schedules over safety. He had not intended to cause harm when he cut corners. He had simply been chasing a target on a spreadsheet that looked like a future. That calculus had a footnote now, a widow's single voice. He couldn't buy back the past. He couldn't unmake the settlements or resurrect the nights Simone had cried in a kitchen while she listened to her children breathe. But he could choose what he would do next. That was the moment the test became a confession. The first thing he did was small and awkward. He got out of the wheelchair. It wasn't cinematic. He had to rely on a physical therapist for a few minutes, a walker propped awkwardly in the corner, and a filmy patience he had never learned to practice. He didn't stand for applause. He stood for contradiction. He chose to reveal the truth and let the consequences fall where they would. When he called Simone, he didn't rehearse a speech. He didn't call lawyers or send bouquets. He walked to the address she had once given him, one that fit like a footprint of the part of the city that never showed up on glossy magazines. He went without an aide, without a car, and knocked on a door whose paint was tired from sun. Simone opened the door, and the house smelled like rice and lemon. There were 3 pairs of small shoes by the threshold. The walls had children's drawings pinned with mismatched tape. A kettle sang in the kitchen. "I shouldn't be here," he said before his hands found the gap in his pockets. He felt ridiculous and raw. "I lied. I wanted to know who stayed. I'm sorry." Her eyes measured him, his clothes, his slight wobble, the tremor in his voice that seemed real. "Cute," she said, as if it were a medal she refused to take. She closed the door a sliver. "You want to come in?" He wanted everything. Instead, he asked for one thing: to speak. Inside, the family rhythm didn't rearrange itself for him. Gustavo stuck his head around a doorway and sized him up. Bento shuffled forward with a toy car that squeaked. Valentina stood by the table, Bunny tucked under her arm, and watched him like a judge who preferred to be surprised. Simone made tea. She put sugar only for herself and milk only for the children. She set a bowl down for him without asking. "What do you want from me?" she asked when the teapot quieted. He humored himself with the idea of a grand gesture, handing her a signed check that would solve months of rent and a new roof and school fees. But he had promised himself, and the truth of the thing, that it wouldn't be performance. So he said plainly, "I want to make it right. I don't know everything it will take. I know I can't make Fabio come back. I know I took advantage of people. I can do things differently. I can sell the place in the sky, give the money to support the boys, change policies at the company so there are no shortcuts that cost lives. But I know promises are air unless you live into them." Simone folded her hands around her cup. She had earned skepticism. It sat on her like armor. "So how do I know this isn't another promise?" "Because I can't ask you to accept words," he said. "Accept work, accept time, accept a space for me to prove it." She watched him. For the first time in the month since the accident, he didn't try to make her take pity. He made her take burden. She thought about it aloud. "You can't buy trust. You can't show up for an hour in a hospital and expect people to forget the ways their lives were cheapened. You want proof, you give me proof. You want trust, you earn it. Start with the small things. Pay for the roof, fix the water, help with school, and don't ever make my kids believe the world can be fixed with a click." He accepted each term with the seriousness of a man learning to be small. Valentina's verdict was simpler. She looked at him for a long time as if testing whether he would look away, then said, "You have to stop making games out of people." "I will," he said. "You have to do the work," she added, "and you have to stay." The last demand surprised him more than the first. He had asked for her time. She asked for his presence, the presence he had been raised never to need. He started with the house. There were blueprints in a folder that his assistants kept for him, and instead of summoning engineers for grand projects, he phoned an old contractor and began with a new roof, basic piping, the kind of home repairs that make ordinary life possible. Money changed hands and things got fixed, yes, but Simone watched how he negotiated those transactions. He didn't insist on how things should be done. He learned the names of the men who came to work, asked about their wages, and listened when they spoke. At the company, he did the quiet work that wasn't good for press releases. He sat in rooms where safety officers had been ignored. He read reports of near misses that had been parked in drawers to preserve a rate of progress. He reordered priorities. Contracts were rewritten to include safety audits. Budgets shifted. He didn't announce it with fanfare. He let the changes happen in memos and an increase of checks to funds supporting injured workers' families. None of it was perfect. There were board members who grumbled, voices in hallways who called him soft for valuing lives over margins. But that friction was part of a different currency he was learning to spend, the currency of accountability. The hardest part was the work of being present with people who had been hurt by him or by systems he oversaw. Simone demanded evidence in the currency she understood: time, labor, and practical aid. He started showing up for parent-teacher nights, for birthdays, for the small and awkward domesticities that never once looked glamorous. He practiced boiling pasta. He learned not to order people around, but to ask what they needed. He sat at counters that were smeared with flour and learned the names of dishes he had previously relegated to private chefs. Valentina watched the changes with a guarded hopefulness. She questioned him in the way children do, not to shame, but to check whether words match action. "Are you going to leave when it gets hard?" she would ask, when he sat down at the dinner table and seemed to count the silence. "No," he would say, truthfully, and then he would prove it by taking the day off from a meeting to take Bento to the dentist or sit through a recital that was mostly out of tune. He learned the smell of the soap Simone used and how Gustavo's laugh started at the wrong beat and went somewhere else, and that their life wasn't a story to check off, but a continuous act of repair. Repair didn't happen overnight. There were setbacks, a contractor who underdelivered, a bank rebuff, a day he reached for the old instincts and found them pallid against the work required to reframe a life. Simone reminded him, sometimes harshly, time, not theatre. She wasn't immune to kindness, but she was not inclined to be forgiving for the sake of ease. She wanted it real. Valentina's role was neither saintly nor symbolic. She was blunt when she needed to be. Once, when he tried to smooth over a withheld detail by telling a version of the truth softened for convenience, she looked at him and said, "When you leave things out, it smells like the old you. I don't want to live with men who leave holes in our history." It hurt him then, more than any press release of the boardroom could have. He had thought, foolishly, that wealth could cushion an ethical lapse. It could not. As the months rolled by, the kitchen table at Simone's house gained the small rituals of a life in progress. They learned to chop vegetables together. Gustavo would insist on setting the plates wrong in ways that made Bento laugh. They argued about whether fish should be fried or baked. Caio learned to refuse the trap of grand gestures and to accept the slow accrual of trust that happens in routine. He learned to apologize without expecting absolution. One evening, a year from the day he'd first taken the chair of feigned weakness, he stood in the doorway of the small house in a way that felt right as an ending and not as a tidy conclusion. The roof had been fixed. The plumbing had been overhauled. There was a dog now, a squat mutt that had learned to bark at strangers and to accept the occasional illicit scrap of breakfast. The children had rooms that had been painted and names on the doors in a child's hand. Valentina was making a list by the window. Gustavo was arguing about the fairness of bedtime. Bento was asleep on the couch with the rabbit tucked under his chin. Simone moved around the kitchen with a grace that had nothing to do with being saintly. She moved with the unglamorous dignity of someone who built a life through effort. Caio sat at the table and watched. He wasn't there to be admired. He wasn't there to be redeemed by a single moment. He was there because he had chosen to stay and to be measured by his staying. When the dog knocked over a bowl and the children yelled and laughed in the same breath, something shifted in him that no boardroom could simulate. He felt his chest expand with a gratitude that did not ask to be displayed on social media. It was a quiet, sturdy thing, like a backboard placed by the side of a road, something that guides and holds. He'd sold the penthouse. He'd redirected funds into a trust for worker safety and for children's education. He refused to sign any release that would be construed as attempting to erase the past. That was one of Simone's terms, transparency. She wanted to keep receipts, not for money, but as evidence that actions matched words, he agreed. The days were not all victory. There were moments when he would watch a contractor's hands and think of Fabio's photograph and feel old and foolish. There were times Simone would withdraw and remind him that trust takes more than his money. There were tears, honest and unperformative. But there were also moments, Valentina teaching him to mend a torn sleeve, Gustavo showing him how to build a small model ship, Bento handing him a toy car and demanding that he race it across the floor, where he felt the slow accretion of belonging. On a certain ordinary morning, Caio stood at the sink in a shirt borrowed from Simone, while the children assembled a masterpiece out of discarded boxes in the living room. Valentina peeked over his shoulder and said, in a tone that carried the small, hard wisdom of someone who had watched adults break promises and had learned the shapes of repair, "You didn't have to be rich to help us. You just had to not walk away." He thought of the hospital room. He thought of the shades drawn and the machines humming in a suite that had decor but no life. He had used tests and lies to chase truth, and had found that truth could only be earned through presence and labor. "You're right," he answered. "I didn't." Simone, who had been filling pasta into a pot, looked at him. She softened in a way that was not about absolution, but acceptance of a part of the world she hadn't thought she would ever give to him, the small kindness of a shared meal. "Keep showing up," she said, and that was both a limit and a gift. There were no announcements, no fanfare worthy of a philanthropic gala. There was the steady sound of a kettle, the rattle of an old washing machine, the laughter of children. Those sounds filled the rooms he had traded for one another, a sold-out penthouse, an unoccupied suite, and a modest house with hummed tunes and the smell of frying fish. Valentina once asked him, casually, why he had ever thought to test the people around him. He sat with her on a step of a park bench and tried to find an answer that wasn't a rationalization. "I was afraid," he said finally. "I thought I might be alone. I thought if everyone left, it would prove that I had nothing but money. Turns out, I had both. Money and the possibility of being alone. But I learned the hard way that it's easier to build a life by giving it away, by doing the small things that matter." She looked at him with that same hard, clear gaze. "Then don't make the same mistake again," she said. He didn't. A year had taught him the value of days rather than declarations. It taught him the arithmetic of humility. Small, consistent actions add up. Selling a view and buying a house didn't fix everything, but it changed the currency of the life they were building together. Where he had once calculated ROI in quarterly reports, he learned to count plates and the number of times Gustavo asked him for help with homework. He learned that responsibility wasn't a headline, but a series of quiet obligations met. On an afternoon, when the light leaned golden against the living room wall, Valentina stood on a stool and drew a picture on a sheet of paper. It was simple. A house with a crooked chimney, people with big smiles, and a dog with a wagging tail. She pinned it on the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a star. "This is our house now," she announced. Simone looked at Caio, and he saw the flash of a past that was not entirely forgiven, but it was a past that had been worked on. She didn't say, "I forgive you," like a closing title. She didn't need to. She started to set plates on the table and called the children. They ate together. It wasn't perfect. The soup had too much salt for Benny, and Gustavo wanted to put on music too loud. Caio learned to take his place at the edges of these domestic rituals, no longer the man who had everything and asked people to prove themselves, but a person who had learned to be part of something ordinary and difficult. That night, when the house was quiet and the dog snoozed at the foot of a child's bed, Caio sat alone on the porch and watched the block breathe. He turned over the photograph he had once kept in a drawer, the one Simone had brought that showed Fabio smiling, and he thought about how a name can anchor responsibility. He had no illusions of redemption being neat. He had no desire to erase the past. He wanted something steadier, to do the work of being accountable, to spend the rest of his days proving that actions had weight beyond a headline. He remembered the first time he had felt truly alone. Bright rooms, empty chairs, a schedule full of meetings that meant little when the lights went out. He had tried to manufacture a test to find authenticity and had discovered only a moral hollow. The truth, finally, was simpler and harder. People stay when they trust you to do the work of being there. Someone once told him that the richest person in the city wasn't the one with the biggest bank account, but the one with the fullest table. That evening his table had children with sticky hands, 2 mismatched mugs, and a pile of homework to be checked. It didn't glitter. It mattered in a way money never had. Valentina, tucked into bed under a blanket he had once considered a costume for charity, said, as she was drifting off, "You know what makes a home?" She whispered. He leaned in, as he had learned to do, curious, present, ready to listen, as if the answer would not be performative, but actual. "People who do the small things every day," she said sleepily, "not because someone looks, but because they care." He held that quietly when the house was still. He would carry it into meetings and into conversations with subcontractors and into afternoons when the old habits tugged at him. He would let the list of small, unremarkable acts be his ledger of repair. At the end of the day, the line between restitution and life had blurred into routine. He had not been absolved by any single apology. He had not been dismissed as irredeemable either. He had been given, begrudgingly and then more freely, the opportunity to prove that people could change their habits and that presence and honest labor were the slow currency of trust. If someone asked him which moment had turned the tide, the hospital confession, Simone's photograph, the first day he swept a floor, or the first time he sat through a school play, he would say it wasn't one moment at all. It was 1,000 small decisions, the accumulation of which formed the shape of a different life. Outside, the city lights still glittered, but they were no longer the only measure of worth. Inside, a refrigerator door wore a child's art like a banner. There were scuffed shoes and an uneven table and a dog with a bark that had learned to accept strangers after a second thought. There were 2 boys who argued and a girl who tied her hair in a fashion that made Caio feel like he belonged. There was Simone, who, though never reduced to a miracle, had offered the possibility of a new domestic order built on honesty and limits. He had tested the people around him and found how badly he'd failed himself. He had learned to stay anyway. It was not a clean story, but it was a real one. In the end, what built the home was not his wealth, but the quiet rituals of presence, the fixing of a roof, the paying of tuition, the putting of plates on a table, the showing up when someone needed you most. If this story moved you, like and subscribe, share where you're watching from. When he folded into the new life he'd stumbled into and worked to keep, he knew there would be more days that tested him. There would be more people to answer for and things to atone for. Forgiveness, when it came, would come quietly and hesitantly. Simone would never be a blank slate of forgiveness. Valentina would hold him to truth. That was right. He should be held. On a morning months later, when the sunlight hit the kitchen at the angle that turned dust into glitter, and the dog snored by the door, Valentina handed him a crumpled paper. It was the drawing of a house with a crooked chimney. She had added a small figure beside the house, a man with a slight stoop, and she had written in curly child letters, "He stayed." He kept that picture on his bedside table. It reminded him daily that the only real currency that mattered in life was the willingness to stay and to repair, not as a public act, but as the ordinary, stubborn work of being present. Share this story with someone who needs hope. Tell us the city you're in.